It's Chapter 20 and we're nearing the end of Crimes Against Christmas.
Ooh.
With me, Heather.
And me, Ferg, of New Old Friends.
Artridge thinks he's cracked the killer's code, but has he got it right? Let's find out. Chapter 20. Not so fast.
Michel's attempt to provide solace for the old Duke only went so far. He was bent double on his cane, braying in pain. I heard a quiet prayer from Vickers, who then spoke up to ask me, "Artridge, how did you know who was next?" Without straightening up, Richtenstein bellowed at the floor.
"Isn't it bloody obvious, you fool? He's the murderer. I told you all in the bloody parlour, but you wouldn't listen. He's been bumping us all off one by one. Well, I'm not scared of you, Artridge. Come at me now if you dare."
With a flourish, he attempted to stand up and draw from within his cane a narrow rapier, but his wingspan wasn't wide enough to put it out in one, and, with one end still caught in its sheath, he stumbled forward. He was lucky he hadn't managed to get the blade loose, or he may well have impaled himself, an act of unwitting, clumsy Harry-carry. The rules for fellows dealing with an agitated member of the older generation aren't so different to those concerning the fairer sex, so I reached for the trusty panacea of a phrase, "Calm down, Your Grace. You'll give yourself a heart attack and do the killer's work for them, or worse, run yourself through. If you just listen to me, I can explain the murderer's plan, just not who they are or why they're doing this yet." The Duke continued to bluster, but appeared content to leave his weapon back in its hiding place and use the cane simply for support.
"Was it awfully bloody hard to figure out your own plan?"
Stop it! Just stop it! I know you're hurting, of course you are.
Michel came to my defence.
You're hurt and you're scared and you're lashing out, which is totally understandable, but not helpful right now. I don't know what Mr. Artridge is going to say. I don't even know that you're wrong, but he was right about Lady de Planis, so we should hear him say it all the same.
It might not have been the most rousing of rallying cries, containing as it did an allowance I could yet prove to be the depraved executioner taking us out with increasing rapidity, but I was touched nonetheless. "Yes, I agree with Michel. I'm not saying it's not him, but we should listen to his theory anyway." This second, heartwarming, if deeply equivocal endorsement came from Vickers, and was apparently enough to overcome the boiling tumult inside aged Richtenstein.
"Very well, I'm listening."
I gestured for Michel to move past me, so that I could address all three of them without having to turn my back. She followed the instruction, and I told them what I'd puzzled out. If we look at who the victims are and how they were killed, it soon becomes obvious. 3 pairs of eyes were warily trained upon my lips, as if I might somehow contrive to kill them with a cleverly constructed sentence. But I'll say this, existential dread makes for great listeners. Nobody was interrupting. I'll list the victims and the methods of their murder in the order I believe them to have taken place, and you shall see. First was, I believe, not Betty but Drummer. He was drummed inside an oil drum. Second was Betty, beaten with a lead pipe whilst piping our starters. After that, Don Crimine is thrown from the roof, Fuctofino is drugged while she does, and poor Missy met her maker milking Daisy. Finally, we have Lord de Planis, the swan of Richtenstein, drowned at sea with his wife, Goosey, sleeping in her bed forevermore. I finished my list and looked at my audience expectantly. Well, surely they could now see what was plain as day to me, what the sick game the killer was playing. But I'd given them too much credit. "I'm not sure I, follow at all," was the priest's response, whereas the Duke reached for his favourite mode of communication, shouted insult.
"It's the ramblings of a bloody madman."
Again, it was Michel who rose to the occasion. It was she who put the final pieces of the jigsaw I had laid out before them in place for the Duke and the priest. She started slowly.
I think I see what he's getting at, but some parts of it don't match up, Mr. Artridge.
Vickers had perhaps been wavering earlier, and with Michel clearly intrigued, he was keen to learn more. "Match up with what?" he asked, and Michel patiently explained.
Some of the deaths match the 12 days of Christmas, Father.
Richtenstein could no longer hide his derision.
"That's not just poppycock, but poppy balls as well. I've never heard anything so bloody ridiculous in my life."
It's not totally ridiculous, Your Grace,
implored Michel.
but I think it just might be a coincidence, Mr. Artridge. They don't all work.
Don't they? I was excited now, fully convinced of my theory and eager to show quite how brilliant I was. A prideful voice in the back of my brain wished to be addressing a larger audience, perhaps in a library with a scotch on hand, but this would have to do. As I relay that to you, I realise it's rather a small wish, and if wishes were in my power, I really should have used it to prevent the killings from happening at all. But we've all got 20/20 hindsight, don't we? I started to fill in my theory with more detail. This is about as far as I can tell. 12 drummers drumming, well, that's drummer in his drum, obviously. 11 pipers piping. Well, not only was there a piping bag with Betty, but I think I also spotted an actual pipe on the shelf for good measure.
I'm not arguing with those two, Mr. Artridge.
Objected Michelle, rather ruining the flow I was building up, to be honest.
But the next one is 10 lords a-leaping, and Mr. Crimine wasn't a lord, and he was thrown from the roof.
I swallowed my irritation and pressed on. But we were led to believe he leaped from the roof, and, in a manner of speaking, he was a lord. The title Don can mean lord in certain criminal circles. Coincidentally, it was actually Crimine himself who reminded me that in Russia, it's quite common for the aristocracy to play up their royal lineage. There, Fuctofino was a princess, whereas here she was more likely to have the title of lady. A lady who died whilst dancing. I hardly think Missy's death whilst actually milking a cow needs explaining, and it would be unbecoming to question her status as a maid, I think you'll agree. Which leaves Edward, the Swan of Richtenstein de Planus, swimming, and his wife, Lady Lucy Goosey Woo de Planus, laying in her bed. I took a moment to recover myself. I'd got quite excited in the course of my explanation, and looked at the faces of the Duke, the priest, and Michelle. In their looks I could read disgust, obviously, fear, naturally, but also, I think, a hint of well-deserved admiration for the feat of deduction I'd just concluded. I know it sounds crazy, I said in closing, but whoever is doing this is obviously a crazy person. If you accept the theory, it's obvious what comes next. 5 gold rings! The voice came from behind me, and before I knew what was happening, I jumped in the air in a manner at odds with the suave sleuth I'd just proved myself to be. I fear the spectral shrieker may even have struck once more. Upon landing, I span around to see Turtle stood behind me, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. "Do you really think that's true, Mr. Artridge?" "Shell, do you really think that's true?"
I don't know, Terry,
she replied.
but it does sort of make sense.
"But Duchess, your earrings, they're gold." The young lovers rushed together and held one another, terror emanating from their every muscle. I'd no idea where Turtle had come from. In truth, I'd actually forgotten about him in all the excitement. But his surprising absence reminded me there was yet another survivor absent from our impromptu meeting. Butler, a man who barely an hour earlier had confessed he was part of a criminal conspiracy. I banished everyone back to their rooms, telling Turtle and Michelle to take extra special care given the ominous portent of her earrings. I doubted they were actually gold, but it wasn't worth risking her life on the metallurgical pedantry of the killer. With everyone safe, or as safe as they could be, I mused on what a case this had turned into. If it was possible, I'd have happily returned the 50 grand just for a ticket off the island, with reasonable expenses deducted, of course. Maybe just a spot of danger money too, just enough for a few decently liquid lunches at the club, and perhaps this rather dashing linen suit I'd had my eye on for the summer season. Oh, and a new hat. Anyway, when I arrived on this godforsaken spit of land, there'd been 13 of us. Now there were only 6, and, if I was honest with myself, I was no closer to knowing which of the half-dozen was dirty, besides my own cleanliness, naturally. The Duke had to be considered, given his knowledge of potions and poisons, and the same could be said of Michelle. Perhaps she in collusion with Turtle. I thought he'd been in their room, so how had he ended up behind me on the landing? There's certainly something odd about that boy. He should stick out like a sore thumb here, but whenever I catch a glimpse of him, before I look too closely, he seems to somehow fit the house. Meanwhile, I was still drawing a blank as to why Father Vickers had found himself invited along to this rotten party. A gap in my knowledge I couldn't help but fill with suspicious thoughts. Last, but not least, we have Butler the butler. He was my first suspect, you'll recall, back when I thought this investigation was the relatively simple matter of preventing grand larceny. Now, though, well, it turned out my hunch had been right. It would have been the butler what done it had it been done, but this series of murders had put paid to his payday. Is there some route to fortune for him without the bauble? Could he conceivably stand to inherit the Richtenstein fortune way down the list of heirs? It's customary among the upper classes to leave a small stipend to one's staff, but not the whole estate. But perhaps Richtenstein was different. That was an interesting concept, but I didn't get a chance to explore it fully as there was a tremendous banging at my door. This was the second time I'd been interrupted whilst cogitating the case, and resulted in another charge added to the rap sheet of our secret shrieker. When Butler and Lady Duplantis had knocked on my door earlier, I'd been relatively calm, but now my blood was up. We Artridges are famed for many things: our good looks, our fine minds, our mellifluous voices, faultless generosity and towering modesty are well known, but it's a fool who forgets our reputation for physical violence when the situation calls for it. So it was, with my own pulse echoing in my ears, I grabbed my mirror-made blade from out my pocket and flung the door open wide, weapon out, shoulders back, teeth ready and bared to fight to the death. In this martial mood, it took me a moment to recalibrate my temper in the face of what I saw in my doorway. John Vickers, now out of his blankety armour and clawing at his dog collar. His whole head had turned puce, a phenomenon I was becoming all too familiar with on this island, and from his throat came a harrowing guttural rasp. There was clearly something lodged deep within his airway. I dropped my makeshift knife, which smashed upon the floorboards, and pulled the priest inside, closing my door behind us. I lay him on the rug and tried to dislodge the impediment. His eyes were bulging, great fearful orbs pleading with me and his Almighty to save his life. I did all I could think of and shoved my fingers inside his mouth as far back as I could reach. Yes, there was something there. I wiggled to try and get purchase. The noises Vickers were making were becoming quieter, less frequent, but no less urgent. I thought I had whatever it was pinned between my fingers and tried to pull it out, but it slipped from my grasp. By now, the priest had stopped making any noise at all, but I tried once more. Digits deep into his gullet, blood mixing with saliva, and this time I was sure I had hold of the object. I yanked it out triumphantly and threw it across the room, expecting the torso of the clergyman to lurch upward with a great intake of breath, the way you see hammy actors in productions of The Tempest emerge from the ocean. But there was nothing. I tried pounding on his chest and blowing into his lungs, but I was too late. I sat back on my haunches and mumbled the only holy text I could remember, the Lord's Prayer. Offering thanks for our daily bread over the corpse of a faithful servant of God was jarring, but I reasoned that for a man like Vickers the wrong prayer was better than no prayer at all. When I finally reached Amen, I crawled over to where the fateful obstruction had landed by the skirting and picked it up. I didn't understand. My 12 days of Christmas theory predicted that the next murder would be committed with a nod to 5 gold rings. Yet here was the 7th body and no gold rings, no jewellery of any kind except the crucifix on his necklace. Vickers, the 7th victim, had choked to death on what appeared to be a small musical instrument, a whistle of some kind. It didn't make any sense. Yet.
Oh, Vickers is gone.
I know. Anyway.
Poor guy. Today is our final Sunday, so we want to highlight a few more wonderful businesses run by theatre professionals for you to check out and support if you can.
We Are Found tell stories through beautiful photography, perfect for families, couples, companies and creators. Check them out at wearefound.uk.
Then there is the absurdly fun Clue Cracker, which is offering some great online escape rooms.
So good.
Perfect for Boxing Day. cluecrackeronline.co.uk. Thank you very much, stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Whoop whoop.